joining us for this author talk and taking some time to chat with us. And I got to know you a little bit in the Northwest, not too much, but more your son Nate, and
Yeah,
sure enjoyed working with him at North Valley, and we've brought him to the Midwest a few times, and
yeah.
um, he inherited your great sense of humor and also I one of my favorite memories of being in the Northwest was actually at Northwest Yearly Meeting. I got to go to a workshop with you and Arthur Roberts
Oh,
about
yeah.
writing, and
Yes.
that was a real treasure to get to do that. So thanks so much
That
for
was
being with
fun.
us.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you would start by telling us some just about your spiritual journey, especially as it's been among friends, among Quakers.
I'll be happy to do that. It's kind of I lived a kind of vagabond life for a long time growing up. My dad was Macy was a friend's pastor for some of those years. And so back in those days, it was often the case that a pastor would be a place for 2 years here or 3 years there and kind of bouncing around a bit. So um, I got started in Berkeley, California. Dad was a pastor at Oakland, Friends Meeting at that time. And then he came to seminary in Oregon. And so we were at Camas, Washington, and at Piedmont Friends in Portland. And and then we moved to Kansas, where Dad was not working for Friends as such, but there were Friends churches there in my middle school years. We went to uh, Wheaton, Illinois, and there weren't Friends churches anywhere close to us there that would be congenial, and even the uncongenial ones were not close. So we kind of had that period of time that I wasn't really in, except for in what I got through my family in the Quaker settings. But I came to George Fox as a student, and I began to learn more about Friends there, and particularly under the teaching of Arthur Roberts, who was a great model and a great teacher. Um, and say that, and I got around Friends quite a lot, doing some ministry of one sort or another, among youth mostly in those years. And then my third seminary, I'm going to skip two seminaries, and my third seminary was ESR. And I think that's where I first got important grounding uh, of Friends. Of course, studied well in that environment. I worked for Indiana Yearly Meeting part-time while I was uh, in school. But I met Quakers from all over the place that I had never met before, and they sometimes thought and acted in ways that had never occurred to me as being okay. Uh, Friends from New York and North Carolina and Kansas, the Berkeley grads, just kind of all over the place. But it was a good environment, and became friends with Elton Trueblood, who became a lifelong friend at that point. I took a course called Writing as Ministry in my first semester there, which he believed in, and you learned a lot of things from Elton that had to do with the syllabus and a lot of things that didn't have to do with the syllabus. But anyway, I was very glad for those years. And then when I eventually went on to my doctoral study, I served a Friends meeting part-time, Smithnick Friends in South Dartmouth, Massachusetts, um, in youth ministry, and then in some pastoral ministry. And that introduced me to a whole new family of friends, the yearly meeting was one that was kind of reunited after being split for many years. So you had sort of FGC folks and FUM folks, and they tried to get along with each other. And sometimes they did, and sometimes not so much. Forget it. I could have Kathleen speak about that, but I won't just now. But that was the meeting I served had been served by part-time people, many of them uh, grad school people, for a number of years, and they were sort of Quaker and sort of Methodist, and but anyway, that was again a deepening of my own journey, and um, and I'll try not to go on too much at length. I'll just say the three places I wound up getting to teach were significant. I had 1 year at Earlham College where I knew was filling a sabbatical year, so I wouldn't be there more than 1 year. And then I had a couple of years I served Reedwood friends, trying to live out an idea that Elton Trueblood thought was very interesting in one of his later books. Um, and the title was almost in my mouth, but not quite. Suggested that every local meeting ought to be, or local church ought to be a kind of an academy where you keep learning and people growing in their faith through good instruction and so on. So people are not stuck on their 16-year-old faith when they actually are now 47 or 52 or whatever. And so my work at Reedwood was to kind of help live out that vision of what a local church could be like. And that was a rich experience. But then I got invited to come to Wichita and teach at Friends University. And those were important years for me. And I got to teach there with my college friend, Richard Foster, who came, and we were there 12 years together, or 11 years together. And then I got invited to come and teach at George Fox, and I've stayed in Newburgh ever since. And I'm glad for the opportunity of living in the same place for a bunch of years. Actually,
A little less vagabond.
Smith Neck, we were at Smith Neck 5 years, and that's the longest place I'd lived any place in my life until I was 30. So, but and I've gotten to speak in a lot of friends' places and have a lot of contacts. So I'm really grateful for it. And Earlham was a really good place with its diversity to deepen my understanding. And of course, at the age you were at that time, why you're learning a lot and growing a lot and so on. So it was a very good environment for me. Yeah.
Yeah, one of our previous author talks was with Jim Newby,
Oh,
and he
yes.
talked a lot about Elton as well and how important that relationship was
Yes,
for
indeed.
him.
Oh, I've just read recently, I should blush to say it's taken me this long, but he wrote an autobiography of Elton Trueblood. It was published in 1990, but I've read it earlier this year. And I was, having known Elton, why it was especially interesting to me, but also very rich in many ways. Yeah.
Yeah.
And one of my notes of thanks, and I think it turned out to be a sort of blessing note, was to thank Jim for having written it.
Mm,
And I think he was glad that I had written. So
yeah.
anyway, yeah.
Well, that's great. And of course somebody else I knew from kind of that group was Dave Kingery.
Oh,
And
yes.
you talked about blessing with letter writing. This was before we started the recording, but
Yes.
that was something that he did a lot, was
Yes.
write those little notes. And
Yeah, we've
so
been
actually,
good friends for a long time, and we overlapped, as with Donna, he and I overlapped in Wichita, which was fun. So anyhow,
That was actually one of the first things we did when we got together. Della and I, we were talking about mutual, acquaintances and people that have shaped us along the way. And Dave Kingery's name came up, and thinking about his letter writing thing,
Yes.
we actually wrote him a note and sent it to him. And
Oh, lovely.
so, yeah, that's
That's
nice.
grand.
So today we're talking about your book on the prophets, Befriending the Prophets,
Yeah.
and it's a lovely little book. And by little book, I don't mean it's shallow, just that it's very readable. And um, actually, I my first reading of it was sitting in the car waiting for my wife to. She had to run in and get groceries somewhere, and I used that time to
That's great.
to read my first reading of it. But it's not your first book by any means. So I don't know if you want to spend a minute just briefly kind of talking about some of your writing before that you've done.
Yeah, I'd love to. And I'm going to show you the covers of some. My first my first real book was on the Psalms and the inner life, and um, I'm looking to see. Oh, there we go. Can you all see that? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Rhythms of the inner life, and um, I was very grateful for it. It eventually wound up with three different publishers, and I think has sold more than any of the others. But I was very glad about it, and uh, and then uh, during the during the 80s, I wrote quite often for uh, Quaker Life magazine, and I was invited to do that by Jack Kirk, who had been the author of a column in the magazine called Let's Be Friends. And when he went to Richmond to become a executive leader in FU at Friends United Meeting, he said, "Wouldn't you take this over?" And so I wrote Let's Be Friends columns for a long time. And there was a period of time when they were also published in the Evangelical Friend magazine back there. And Jack Wilkets was the editor of Evangelical Friend, and we were friends going back into my college years. And so the uh, uh, Friends United Press decided they could collect my essays that had been written most magazine essays become a newspaper at the bottom of your bird cage or that's something like that, but these actually got printed. And so it's mostly, this is a good bathroom book because they're about 500 words. So you won't hurt yourself physically too much. And you can finish them quickly or, depending on how your day's going. But anyway, stepping in the light, life and joy and power, and it's mostly columns, some collected articles, and I was really glad for that to happen. It's also available these days digitally. I think it was kind of, um, I mean, they don't tell me how much they need to charge for my book, so. But I thought it was a little overpriced at the time, not because it wasn't really a treasure, but But about the same time, I wrote a book called Laughing Pilgrims, and it's on. In my reading and study had been going two different directions. One is I was very interested in spirituality and doing some teaching in that area and growing in that area. And at the same time, I was interested in how humor was working. And these two things came together. And so this is sort of a spirituality and humor book. And I tried to, when I was reading humor stuff, I found books that were really descriptive and helpful in that analysis. And then I found a bunch of, but they weren't funny. And then I found a bunch of other books who were funny, but they didn't help much with analysis. And I thought, if I can write something that helps make things clear and also get a laugh at the same time, that might be a good thing to do. And so that's what this is. And it, all of these are still available somewhere or another. Part of the humor of this book to me is that my name on the cover is wrong. My name is Howard, middle initial R Macy, and I saw drafts of the cover which were correct. But when it got
So
published,
funny.
it's Howard
Ah,
M Macy. So
só começa.
so and probably more
Isso.
grammatically correct, it should be Howard is Macy. But anyway, and then the last thing I've done came out just a few years ago now. Um, I had been given the opportunity to actually teach a course called Humor in the Bible. And um, the results of my teaching were such that I thought, I ought to write something about that, because a number of my students came to think that the Bible was more accessible to them than it had been before they thought about using humor. And so I wrote up a book which is called Discovering Humor in the Bible, uh, an explorer's guide. And the intent of the book was to give people the tools to see humor for themselves. So I didn't just tell them everything I thought was funny, but I gave some, so people can benefit from this and work through it and read the text and see it for themselves, with a little hint now and again about what they might see. And I saw somebody recently said they've been using it in a study group when they're having a good time, or another person just working through it bit by bit, having a good time. I have a friend who's working through it and translating into language from New Guinea, where he served as a missionary for a time, and doing word study in English and whatever the language is in New Guinea and so on. So, and then there's really a booklet, but that comes from a series of lectures I gave at New England Yearly Meeting way back, and it's called The Shalom of God. It was the Bible half hours in the early 70s at New England Yearly Meeting. So this anyway for books, and then I've done some writing articles, chapters, this sort of thing along the way. But the one, of course, that you waved, I'm going to wave back at you, because it's my most recent, and it's one I've wanted to do for a long time, but feel fortunate to have figured out how and get to somebody to think it was worth publishing. So
Great. Thank you for those reviews. I loved your books on humor.
thank you.
Did
That's great. Yeah.
did you work on that with Elton Trueblood at all? Because he had done that Humor of Christ
Well,
book. Or...
his book, The Humor of Christ, was a very important resource, because he was a very good analyst. He doesn't write humorously so much, but he actually had a wonderful sense of humor, and as a fun storyteller. And I always loved it, because sometimes when you're sitting there and he's telling a story, he'd kind of crack up before he got to the punchline. And I thought that was even more fun. And the punchline was pretty good too. But
Yeah.
a person who did work with me on the Laughing Pilgrims book was Tom Mullen, who
Mm-hmm.
was almost without peer in writing humorous stuff. And so
Yeah.
we'd sit down, and he had read through my draft stuff, and we'd look at places, and sometimes he'd analyze that and make some really good suggestions. He was a fine writer. And then sometimes we just tell stories that were not in the book and just laugh our eyes out. And it was a wonderful friendship and mentorship on his part. I was very grateful for it. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, I like his quote. Uh, Deep within all of us is the need to be shallow.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
shifting gears from humor to the prophets, you can correct me. It seems like a pretty significant shift, but some writers and faith leaders avoid the prophets because it can be kind of intense. And you quote Abraham Heschel, which I like the his description is that they can be some of the most disturbing people who ever lived.
Yeah.
So, with that in mind, what inspired you to dive in and write a book about them?
Well, I finally got acquainted with them, and I'm going to make a reference to ESR again and all the strange people that showed up there. Uh, and I haven't said this in other forums particularly, but the dedication of the book, it says for friend David Wetherell, and some of you would have known David, but he's been gone now for a long while. But in memory and gratitude. When David came to ESR, he came from New England. I think they were in Maine before they came. Um, and I learned his story about becoming a Christian. I wasn't quite sure people could actually become Christians that way. And I soon learned that, in fact, he was very serious about it, his being a Christian. And his first wife actually gave up on him because he was so serious about wanting to follow Jesus. And um, so we lived up on, in those days, we called the apartments up on south of campus there, Fertility Hill. I don't know if that's still local jargon. Uh, a lot of married student housing up there. And and they lived near us and we got acquainted uh, and actually while we were there, they had a baby and I became giant baby when I was taking care of the kid. But one occasion, I think it was maybe a Christmas time, might have been a birthday or something, we're about the same. Anyway, David gave me a copy of Heschel's The Prophets. I didn't know of it. He knew lots of stuff, and there's lots of stuff I didn't know, and he helped me learn. But when I read Heschel and got acquainted with the prophets through his uh, analysis and teaching about it, I came to be very taken by him, partly because he was trying to speak to what the prophets knew, how they ticked. A lot of the inwardness of the prophets, and when you do textbook stuff about prophets, why often they'll describe this prophet lived when, and this is the character of his message, and but not much really speculation. And I suppose at one level you'd have to say speculation, but about um, who the prophets were and why it mattered to them and so on. And so that was a wonderful new insight for me. And also, because of the way he spoke of it, it gave me an insight to their kind of sense of connection with God.
Hmm.
I grew up in an environment where mostly people were thinking prophetic text sort of drifted down and the prophet messenger would grab the text and go read it to somebody, which seems to me drastically wrong now. But to see that how the prophets came to know and live with God and be shaped by their experience of God's nearness, uh, that it opened them up as persons and opened up their message for me in ways that I hadn't encountered before. And so that was the beginnings of that, and I continue to be deeply affected by Heschel's understanding of those
Hmm.
things. So that's the starting place. And then over the years, I got to teach about the prophets and read in them more, and that just kept growing. So actually, this little book um, has stuff in it that I basically wanted to do for 30 years and never quite figured out how. And I think finally got a grip on what I could do and gave it a try here in my retirement. And I'm really grateful that it's happened. Yeah.
Great. So I'm not sure if you're able to provide a definition, but what is a prophet? And along with that, why should we befriend them as you invite us to do with the title of the book?
Uh, I I have a definition that I used and I want to read it out to you from the book, but it says a prophet is a visible sign and enduring witness that God is here, that God cares, and that God is actively working to renew wholeness or shalom in all creation. And I said visible sign because some of these folks, they would have their prophetic ministry, but that they're hanging around sometimes just in ordinary ways and sometimes in more extraordinary ways, like Ezekiel doing street theater or Isaiah going around butt naked for a few years, or Jeremiah not going to parties and not going to funerals, uh, and those kinds of things. Um, just who they were was visible even when they weren't talking. So that's why I use visible sign, but also they gave witness in a variety of ways. And again, the thing that's particularly engaging for me, again, this is from Heschel, that God is here, that God cares, and God is actively working at Shalom. I think there are a lot of folks back then as well as now who didn't understand in very visible ways God's presence. And sometimes that has to do with them just neglecting what God expects. Sometimes it has to do with them being hopeless, saying that nothing good is going to happen here. Sometimes it makes them feel put off from God. And there's a lot of, sadly, it goes back centuries and centuries, but a lot of Christian teaching that basically makes God absent from us. And it kind of goes back to Gnosticism, where, the most holy things are the things that are most distant from sin and the world and that kind of stuff. And so you hear people say stuff like, God is so holy that he can't even stand to be anywhere near you. So the God who is distant. And it seems to me that we do better to say, no, God is right here. And that's the biblical witness, the pre-Gnostic stuff. The biblical witness is God is right here. God cares. God's doing stuff. And he's trying to engage you in what's going on. And I think that changes profoundly how people respond to whatever message we might offer. So a lot of people these days, I think, have kind of taken up the notion that God's mad as hell at us, and God can't stand us, and God's not going to get anywhere near us. And if you can't get past that kind of, it's been taught a lot of ways. If you can't get past that, to know that God loves us and is seeking to be in relationship with us and transform us in ways that would be pleasing to God and to us and so on. Why it's uh, people are resistant. So I think that well, let me let you ask another question. I could get into making a lecture here of sorts that I don't.
It's
But I think I think it's very important to recognize God's presence and
mhm,
then to live into that.
mhm. Yeah, I've had that experience that you're saying. It's very mixed messaging sometimes when it comes to God's orientation toward us. You know, it's like, oh, God loves you so much you can't even imagine it, and then
Yeah,
in the next breath, but God can't stand to look at you. You
yeah,
know, and
exactly.
so um, maybe the prophets help us. Befriending the prophets maybe helps us see that presence in the world. Is what I hear you saying, that the
Well,
nearness and the
yes, and
care.
actually, let me go on to say one of the places that in the prophets that I find most moving is in Jeremiah 9. God tells people not what not to brag about. Um, that you're smart, that you're rich, that you're strong, which are kind of the normal brags for nations and people. But he says instead, if you're going to brag, and this is not condemning bragging. It's just saying if you're going to pat yourself on the back, brag that you know God,
Mm,
and
mm,
and it goes on a little bit more, and you know God, and you know what God delights in. And then he uses some of the typical words in the prophets. I mean, delights in justice, in mercy, and so on.
mm,
And and I've come to think of this as coming to the prophets coming to know God, which is the word pathos will show up here in a little bit, but coming to know God. But when you know what God delights in and you come to share that delight, this is a movement of transformation of your heart to God's heart and presence in ways that I think completely revolutionize how we do life together.
mm. Yeah, maybe that's a good, maybe this is a good point to get into that pathos of God or pathos of God that Abraham Heschel, Joshua Heschel talks about, um, the prophets communicating that. What does that, what does that mean? The
Well,
pathos of God.
we that root shows up in empathy, sympathy, those kinds of words. But basically, saying God, when I say God cares, I mean God's engaged, and what happens matters. God, um, I think we might even say, with recognizing metaphor, I mean, God has emotions about this. He dislikes some things, loves other things, and so he's not distant from humans. That's which we've already kind of touched on. And what the prophets learn is to share God's pathos, and so they um, sometimes it may even be that they share it too much. That is, if you know how sometimes if a spouse gets offended, but you're getting along with it okay, but the other spouse it gets really offended and kind of gets carried away trying to make things right. You know, I mean, so they may their language may sometimes even be too dramatic or harsh even.
Hmm.
But the larger point is the prophets understood how God is responding to what's going on in the culture where they're speaking to people. So Uh, for example, if people are, well, typically in the prophets, one of the things they talk about a lot is when people are getting cheated, the injustice is done, and uh, they're taking advantage of vulnerable people, widows, orphans, immigrants, the poor, and then that's an easy target. And but God doesn't like that to happen. God wants these people to be cared for and watched out for and so on. And so it desires justice instead of the kind of taking advantage and hurting people in that way. So the prophets would go to the marketplace and they could see there's some folks that are putting chaff in with the wheat before they weigh it out to give to people, or they have people are using false weights. Uh, Not that that would ever happen these days. Um, People uh, around Thanksgiving time, why inspectors have to be out there making sure people aren't injecting turkeys with water before they freeze them to increase their weight, for example. Or I had friends who got involved in trying to overturn uh, the practice or companies that do payday loans, which is a way of taking advantage of poor people and impoverishing them even more. And that was a kind of a prophetic action, or a number of other kind of scams that you can talk about. But God cares about that stuff, and the prophets care too. And so that's that kind of mutual engagement. Say, no, this matters. This God is not absent. God is not kind of just winking an eye and say that's okay. That these people are important.
What I hear you saying, Howard, is that the prophets have both this kind of deep sense of spirituality or connection with God, and also that flows out into the social engagement, speaking out for mercy and justice and
Absolutely.
righteousness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really a reflection of God's love um, and not isolated from the kind of ordinary life. Actually, one of the chapters of the book, I think it's Compelling Vision. It talks about four of four of the big words that show up in the prophets all the time, and basically say the prophets are saying, this is not that complicated. And
Mm.
Amos and Micah both are examples where Amos says, I'm tired of your feasts and festivals and your choirs and your carrying on and so on, but let justice roll down like rivers.
Mm.
Or Micah, and before the famous section of Micah where he says, do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. That just previous part, I think is mocking the Israelites and what he's saying, because basically he has them saying, what do you want? You want more sacrifices? You want do you want you want me to give you my kids? What? And he just basically said, it's not that complicated.
Mm.
Do justice, be loving uh, toward others, and be under walk along with God. Take your cues.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm.
the the big words that we wind up saying stuff like righteousness, that we make that to be a fussy word somehow. Uh, it's a spiritual word. It's basically, do the right thing. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
these aren't hard concepts, but and I think so when the prophets eventually go out and call people out in the marketplace and say, hey, look, uh, And they might have even said to some of them, you do this every week. You're cheating people. Now just quit it. Don't do that. And so on.
Hmm. Well, it's a really helpful look into kind of the spiritual and social world of the biblical prophets, and maybe we'll even befriend them a little bit. And but then kind of translating that to present day, are
Yeah.
there still prophets? What does prophetic ministry look like today?
Well, yes, there are still prophets, and some we might among us agree that there are several um, folks that have been pretty well known for that kind of service. I think of Tony Campolo, whom I've gotten to hear several times, or um, Jim Wallace, and I even had another name written down that keeps wanting to go away. Shane Claiborne, who's been well known in Pennsylvania. Uh, I and I think there are issues that people need to address. Actually, some of our friends' groups have been, I think, good to bring a prophetic word, particularly around issues of justice and taking care of the vulnerable people and that kind of thing. I mean, Friends Committee on National Legislation often addresses those issues. AFSC has done historically and currently some of those kinds of things. Um, but I think mostly um, I think there are lots of prophets, and I think they be mostly unknown, except in the kind of communities in which they function. Uh, Calling people's attention to what God requires, or maybe even to specific ideas about how they may act that out. And um, the one of the things that happens is that the prophets are uh, often deeply misunderstood, and one one of the key reasons is that people don't understand that these prophets that we read in were actually speaking to people they knew and in a culture they were part of.
Mm.
So people go to the prophets and try to suggest that actually what the prophets back then were talking about only really had to do with the 20th century or whenever.
Right.
That we that now prophetic interpreters today can figure out who they meant and when the world is going to end. And I grew up in circles where we saw a lot of that, and the 1970s were a particularly bad era for that, with the Left Behind series and uh, the late great Planet Earth and the movies that scared the wadding out of people, uh, with a long-term bad effect, actually. And and I think that we need to read the prophets in ways that understand what the principles were, what they cared about, rather than trying to see if something they said back then might finally make sense to somebody today. So that's kind of misleading. We'd like to, I think that's partly curiosity, partly control. We'd like to know stuff and know how to plan for the end of the world. Um, but what we don't recognize is the prophets were speaking to particular people in particular times, which we might have to even learn something about to kind of understand their message at that point in time, um, rather than stuff that we can seize on to use today.
Mhm.
One, this is sort of a pet peeve thing, and I'm kind of partly right and partly wrong about it. Um, but graduation time, where people often send cards of, God has plans for you and so on, which was a message of encouragement, when people were already in deep trouble. But I don't see many cards out there with Hallmark and other folks saying, straighten up, I'm going to drag you out with hooks and carry you off to no graduation cards like that. The warning messages, and there's something good about taking up the messages of hope, certainly, but sometimes we take them up a bit uncritically, and other times it's right for us to recognize that there is hope, and that we have witness to it not only being promised in Scripture, but also having been experienced in the biblical contexts and so on.
It's the old thing about afflicting the comfortable and comforting the afflicted kind of
Yeah, yeah.
thing.
Well, the other thing to say about the prophets too is uh, they're not always speaking words of correction. And I think we tend to think that prophets are mostly cranks who say nasty things to people, and but they often offer words of guidance and of immediate hope and encouragement. There are a lot of kinds of messages they offer, and you've included here a quotation in the notes that we exchanged about a prophet being a pain in the neck. From Merton, he says
Yeah.
it may be true every prophet is a pain in the neck, but it's not true that every pain in the neck is a prophet. Well, that's number one. Not all pain in the necks are prophets, that's for sure. But also it's true that the prophets came uh, to offer guidance and hope and
Mhm.
to tell people of the love of God and how God's care is encountering and calling them to a kind of faithfulness. Yeah.
Well, first I want to say, if there might be somebody listening that wants to take up that card, that there might be a niche market for those hook graduation cards. I don't know, but I appreciate those clarifications about misconceptions we have about the
Yeah.
prophets, because I I grew up in more kind of evangelical circles, and I did hear a lot of that kind of end times, you know, speculation based on the prophets. But as I then kind of on the other end of things in some of the more progressive circles, I hear prophetic being used, and that's why I like that Merton quote, that it's kind of anything that's more critical or edgy or critiquing is equated with prophetic,
Yeah.
which I think, as you say, is sometimes the case, but not necessarily. Those are not necessarily always the same thing.
Well, sometimes, every once in a while, someone will say something to me like, maybe I'd been prophetic, and I kind of worry about it and thinking, dang, did I sound that cranky? Or,
Right.
but yeah. And
Well, we've
sometimes I probably have, and maybe not always under the direction of the Spirit. So that's another possibility.
it's good to be humble about those things, I guess. Um, we've got about maybe 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up for people's questions and comments.
Okay.
But I did want to make sure before we wrap this up to just recognize that we're in a very political time, right? And it's all about these elections and candidates and
Yeah.
all that stuff. And so it's easy to kind of get wrapped up in that being the most important thing right now. And it is important. I mean, the campaigns are important, but how do we distinguish between the prophetic and the political? is there overlap, or are those very different things? And how do we talk about that, maybe especially for folks who are in congregations and trying to minister prophetically in a time like this?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and it's complicated as you suggest. I mean, first of all, we just say God's presence in the world and God's sovereignty in the world is political. And and the choices we make with what we might regard as human political stuff is not just clean apart from and I mean, of course, part of this issue is uh, the classic question of how you think about the sovereignty of God and the presence of God. I mean, if the God is here, and why does all this rotten stuff happen? I mean, that classic question. And if I get the blessing book done, I think I'll write a short one on that and make a bundle because everybody has that question and haven't solved it yet. No, wink, wink. Uh, some people have made a bundle actually trying to answer that question in public, but I think um, what we do in kind of common politics and in people who are committed to God do have to do with each other. And I'm going to get probably political just now in a way, but for example, in our current cultural stuff in the United States, we have a phenomenon that people are calling Christian nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
It's not new in one respect because people have, from the beginnings of the colonies and the United States, used language of exodus and deliverance and um, to talk about the people movements, the founding of governments here. Um, so we wind up uh, saying things like, quoting things like from Chronicles, if my people who are called by my name and will repent and so on. And often I'll see this in a meme with an American flag flying behind it. And I'm thinking, um, you, we've adopted the notion of Israel's chosen us to speak of American chosenness and that kind of stuff. So that's a long history of that, including language of manifest destiny going back a century and a half and so on. But now we're in a situation where um, some Christian folks have decided that they want not only that they need to run the government, and they've made bargains about this and have been putting this on now for more than 40 years, going back to when people decided that Jimmy Carter wasn't really Christian enough, why we got puff biographies about what a saint uh, Ronald Reagan was, and backroom deals between uh, right-wing political operatives and leading Christian ministers at that time, and they've constructed quite a mess. And I think that there's a place for people to raise the questions about fidelity, about so like who do you love here? You're going to love God, or are you going to love this political construct? Um, so and that, of course, that was one of the major themes of the prophets: is who are you going to be loyal to here? And I'm convinced that Christian nationalism is not loyalty to God. It's a loyalty to a lust for power and getting our more than our piece of pie, and using the church as a means to do it. So I mean that's a current issue that seems to me requires some kind of some kind of witness.
Mhm.
But there are justice issues are all over the place, or the lack of care, lack of showing love. It's all over the place, and sometimes it's can be local, sometimes it can be broader than that, sometimes it's systemic, and people address that. I think there are people who are addressing that with prophetic sense all over the place. Again, some I tell a story in the book that you may recall, but I had a friend who'd been a Methodist pastor out on Cape Cod, and this was a time when the properties on Cape Cod were becoming more and more valuable, and a woman in the congregation he served um, suddenly became widowed, and sometimes it takes a little while to figure out what to do with family matters and how all that works and what your obligations are. So she was a little slow on mortgage payments, and he learned that the local bank was planning to, I mean, licking his chops, planning to take over her property at the earliest possible date because they wanted to reclaim the property and then resell it for a fancy profit. And he went into the bank and basically said, I know what you're doing. I know it's legal, but it's wrong, and you're not going to do it. And that action, which I think is sort of like a prophet storming in somewhere, uh, saved her the loss of her home and a lot of trouble otherwise. So
Mhm.
that, but that's one guy in a local place doing what needs to be done, both out of love and sense of justice. And I think that there are a lot of places where those kinds of things happen or should happen
Yeah,
um, in our experience.
I like that sense of prophetic ministry can be both. It can be local or it can be national, international. It's at all levels. And sometimes it's more hidden and sometimes it's more public. And uh, so we have a lot of people that we serve that are Quaker leaders of one kind or another. Might be some of those prophetic types or not, but wondered if you had 1 minute to give advice to Quaker leaders, what would you what would you say?
Well, I've come to think that one of the most important things is for people is to nurture people so that they come to know God in ways that form them
Hmm.
and help form people toward um, knowing what God delights in
Hmm.
ways that it's not just head knowledge, but this is a knowing which is transformative knowledge. And I think it's out of that um, formation that prophetic ministry can arise and people can learn to see stuff, learn uh, how to listen and be drawn to act. Uh, I think one of the chapters suggested that prophets were good listeners. Well, I think our tradition in particularly is one in which we try to help people learn how to listen. And and I think that would be very helpful
Hmm.
if we did that. I think I'm grateful for uh, Richard Foster's work. Good, his Quaker being shows up in all that he does, though it isn't right to a narrowly Quaker audience. And his one of his mentors, Dallas Willard, published his first sort of accessible book. Was called Hearing God. I think it's got a new
Hmm.
title by now, but this may be early 80s. But
Hmm.
again, it's all about listening for God's guidance and then trying to live into um, what God requires. And
Hmm.
and I think that kind of a personal attentiveness and listening are a way forward that may be different than just trying to say, okay, here are the principles. Now let's think about how we do stuff. I mean,
Hmm.
we're can be prompted out of the relationship rather than just out of thinking, having yet another workshop on how do we do simplicity or something like that.
Hmm. It makes me think of the quote from Paul Tillich, which I think he was talking about Bonhoeffer, but he said the first act of love is to listen.
Mm,
And it seems like you could almost say the first act of prophecy is to listen,
yeah,
which is kind of counterintuitive. You think the prophetic is about speaking loudly, and maybe it is, but at first listening closely sounds like. So that's good. So let's take, we've got about 15 minutes left. If folks have questions for Howard, or some outrage or encouragement or whatever you've got going, I'm sure Howard can handle it. If you've got something to say, go ahead and just unmute yourself and speak up. I think we're a small enough group, we can just do that.
Howard, I see a lot of uh, individual voices trying to speak to Christian nationalism. I see fewer voices speaking to it on the large scale. The two that you've mentioned are the big divide that I face where I live is that politically, and therefore in much deeper thinking, we've become two separate groups who simply seem incapable of listening to the other.
yeah,
Because minds are made up. I see the vitriol on Facebook that is just absolutely appalling. I refrain from even voicing things there because I know what the ultra conservative stuff does in me, makes me so angry. And to just come back at that is sort of worthless, it seems to me. So, what advice do you have for those of us who want to speak our truth and the truth that we're given, but can also sort of assess the situation, probably not so different from what the prophets faced, the biblical prophets? What is the Christian action in this kind of situation? And thank you for going back in Christian nationalism, because I was raised in that. God and country is what it was all about, and they were all woven into one. So what is a faithful way today, if not prophetic, to try to speak in a world that's so clearly divided that there is no hearing of one another?
I've noticed recently on talking head shows that the first thing that someone will say after a person's asked a question is, well, that's a very good question, because they don't have an answer yet. So that's a very good question.
Okay.
You started us off with the
No
softball
magical
question.
answer.
That that I don't have an easy answer for that. I'm pretty sure that just kind of standing up on one of the sides of the battle lines and yelling across is probably not helpful.
Exactly.
I think as you can to be call attention to the requirements of love or make witness to and act toward other people in a loving way is probably helpful. But
Yes.
it is so disheartening that people get stuck in a place and even around this kind of prophetic stuff. I mean, we've got people who are acting like they're prophetic, christening leadership, saying this is exactly what God had in mind. And
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it's at one level, it's just dead wrong that, but it's to just say that that's dead wrong is a difficult piece to do. Sometimes their prophets were given creative ways to witness, and sometimes even humorous ways to witness, and you would wonder whether there might be ways, and there may in fact be ways that I don't know of directly, but that people are addressing those issues in ways that do sneak around the barriers, and that this is a really, really difficult time with that.
Thank you.
If I think of a clever answer,
Please let me know.
yeah, I'll get back to you.
I'm enmeshed. I'm part of a Mennonite retirement community, and it's been really interesting to finally take the time to learn more
Yes.
about the similarities and the differences. And I'm involved in an inclusive church. And we recently had an old Swiss Mennonite church here that divided because the question was, well, it's all about inclusivity. And could we agree to disagree? And the answer was no. And respect one another. And the answer was no.
Yeah.
There's another Mennonite church who for many years has had in their statement that's on their website, I love, it says, in our congregation, we do not all think alike, but we strive to love alike. And I think that's just the most beautiful statement. It's awfully hard to do in the heat of the moment, but yeah. Thank you,
Yeah.
Howard.
Thanks for sharing that. That's kind of a sadness in
Mhm.
lots of places that we had divisions over that
Yes.
that particular issue. Yeah. Yeah.
Howard, I remember back in 2003 when the Iraq War was about to start. I had just a glimpse of an understanding that perhaps the American empire was starting to fail, and as all empires must. And sitting here in Norway, of course, it seems even more likely, perhaps, than when I lived in the United States, that the empire must fail, because empires are not built on truth and justice. They are built on power. And I wonder whether if that is the case, should we be supporting the crumbling of the empire?
Hmm.
Should we be trying to build bridges and ease communication? And
I think we can speak of the flaws or maybe you can use the word deceit of empire. Say, this isn't real. This isn't going to last. These are the things that we see that without necessarily saying, and I hope it fails quickly.
yeah,
But things, I think to name the aspects of empire that are morally corrupt or will undercut it. I think that's sometimes is a useful thing. Or to remind people, and again, this is so hard to do, but to know in one's own sensibility, but even sometimes to say, you know, this thing is not so powerful as you think, and that there is a sovereignty that it stands above all sovereignties, and can act, and maybe is acting. But again, that complexity of that whole issue about God being present, but not God directly, or seeming not directly acting in a particular circumstances, is to understand that is a bit above my pay grade, I guess. But I guess I want to witness that God, God is sovereign, and God is here, and God is loving, and God is moving toward God's purposes, even in the face of people who don't seem to give a damn about it. But that's not a simple answer either, you know. So you kind of live in that confidence and witness to it as you can, or act as you can against the injustice and the overreach of empire, and just know that it's not ultimate, and just to hold that tension between what we witness day to day, and at the same time, what we know is a larger truth about all of that is. And the prophets were caught in that kind of complex situation. I mean, there are prophets, for example, who are saying, when Babylon is already destroying Judah, say, no, we're strong, we can make it, and cheering for the king. While Jeremiah is saying, don't talk like that. It's not going to happen. But they're folks that are happily going, maybe they got to eat at the king's table, I don't know, but you know, they're happily saying, hey, this is fine, you're great, and think we're going to be delivered. And Jeremiah gets thrown in a cistern, hoping they'll just kill him down there for saying, no, that ain't it. And the false prophets, as he identified them, were wrong, but they were there. Oh.
Speaking of the prophets, one of the books that's been formational for me is Walter Brueggemann's book on the prophets, and I remember reading that and him just railing on Solomon, and I almost felt bad for Solomon, but it was I think what he was highlighting was the tension that's there even in the Hebrew Bible about, well, was David and Solomon, were those the glory days of Israel, or were those the days when they were corrupted by power and privilege?
Yeah.
I think it's something we still struggle
imagination.
with.
Yeah.
The prophetic imagination. Thank you.
A great book, and Walter Brueggemann, probably among the other writers, has been very influential and helpful to me.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember the first time reading that book, and yeah, Solomon kind of gets dusted up pretty good. Yeah, and rightly so. I mean, the taxes, the forced labor, the manipulation of stuff that he did was not in keeping with kind of the straight and narrow. Let's just say it that way.
Yeah.
And to compare it to the pharaohs and their abusive ways, there are ways in which that was right. So yeah.
And it seems like those those tensions, those different visions are still there with, the people of God today. It's just like, is our hope in getting, just godly leaders in positions of power, or is it us being the people of God and kind of
Yeah.
being an alternative to those systems
Yeah.
and structures? And I hear that maybe in that question about the empire,
Yeah.
is there too. Are we trying to make a more benevolent empire, or are we trying to bring it down, or just disregard and let God do God's work at those levels? But
I'm not a fan of Oliver Cromwell or uh, the kings that followed him, because I just remember how many were going to be a godly government people through Quakers in jail and Baptists and a lot of other folks who would not comply with what these quote godly leaders were going to have them do.
right.
So the notion of separation of church and state, which a lot of these Christian nationalism people seem to think is sort of a fluffy idea, is I know enough church history to think, actually that's a pretty good idea to not like the emperors do your religion for you.
Right. Kind of, you would think that Quakers would, with a sense of history, would be skeptical of those promises,
Well, then
those hopes.
some of us are.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
it's just about 8:30, so I do want to honor our time. Bob Henry said I have to take off, but thank you, Howard and ESR, for making this possible. I appreciate hearing Howard's voice on the subject.
Thank you, friends.
Thank you so much. There's Deborah waving goodbye and everybody. So maybe just
Lovely.
as we leave, would you mind just reading that blessing, that Aaronic blessing
Yes,
that
I
you
will, and I'll send a copy your way somehow. May
Great.
God bless you and watch over you. May God beam at you and be tender-hearted with you. May God look you full in the face and give you peace. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Howard, and everybody for for joining us. Della, would you mind hanging back just for a minute?
No problem.
Okay. And Howard as well, if you could.
Okay.
And Katrina. Did you stop the recording?
Where did it go? Oh,
Sometimes you have to go to the little more button.
yeah, it was. I got it.
Oh, I see it up here. Okay.